Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the legal and government host, and due to the special election in the congressional race for the 7th Congressional District, we have been interviewing candidates, and today we have Jason Schurz. Jason, well, welcome to the show.
Jamie, thanks for having me on.
So Jason is running as a Republican, and there is a primary on the Republican side. Your opponent is Tom Tiffany. We had an opportunity to interview him some time back, around Christmas or something, and here we are, late January. The primary coming up is February 18th.
That's correct.
So the third Tuesday in February. Make sure that you folks get out there and vote. But we're here today to talk a little bit about your candidacy. But before we do that, let's talk about your background and your qualifications. You know, where you're born and raised, what's your education?
Sure. So I was a military brat growing up. My father was serving in the Army, so I was actually born in Fort Knox. But I spent the majority of my childhood growing up in Menominee, just down the road from here. When I graduated from Menominee High School, I went down to La Crosse, where I was a football player and ROTC cadet. When I graduated from La Crosse, the next day I received a commission in the U.S. Army as a second lieutenant. I was an infantry officer, moved from La Crosse down to Fort Benning, Georgia, where I began my infantry officer basic training.
And let me just stop you that.
Yeah.
La Crosse, you said played football. What was your major?
I was international relations, political science.
Okay.
I wanted to be able, I knew I wanted to have, for me, ever since I grew up, I wanted to have a career in the military. That was what I wanted to do. That's how I wanted to give back to this nation. I mean, my father did it, uncle did it, both my grandfathers did it. I guess you could say that was our family business.
Okay.
And that's how I saw myself, not only giving back, but enjoying in the process. And when I was at La Crosse, I was fortunate to be able to play football. It was something I enjoyed. Not everyone has the opportunity to play college athletics. I would greatly push, anyone, certainly young people, to get involved.
Right.
Certainly in any activity, whether it's athletics or any post-curricular activity.
So you did ROTC, and that only spurred your interest then in the military, and then you end up in Fort Benning. So you've got a college education, and you're a second lieutenant. And I'm sorry I interrupted you, so pick up your story there.
No, it's okay. So I began what was really the kind of your entry-level training for an officer. So I was given instruction in platoon-level tactics, which is leading about 40 soldiers or so. You do things, ambushing, conducting reconnaissance, various types of infantry missions, being trained on weapon systems, and given kind of just really your how-to of leading. When I was done with that, I went to Ranger School. Ranger School is it's a miserable experience. I've met a lot of lifelong friends in it, though. Mm-hmm. And the average course length is 61 days. It takes about the average person 80 days to finish it, myself included. You're fed about 1,500 calories a day. You march anywhere between 15 and 20 miles a day, and you get an average of 3 hours of sleep a night.
Wow.
So does everyone else around you. And now, once everyone's put into those conditions, you're asked to lead others who are just as tired and miserable as you are. And you're evaluated on your ability to do that. It requires not only being able to lead when you're the one in charge, but also be a great follower when you're not the one in charge. And I think it teaches many lessons, not only about military tactics, but about what you can push yourself and what you can push others to do. People often ask me what was my favorite part of Ranger School, and I say graduating.
Right.
But one of my best friends I met in Ranger School, that's actually how I ended up meeting my fiance, was through him. And it's an experience I'll never forget, and it's something I remind myself about, certainly when you're dealing with the other parts of life that can sometimes be grueling. When I was done with that training, I went through airborne school, so I jumped out of planes a little bit. And then I kind of wrapped up my training and went to another post, which was Fort Lewis, Washington, which is just south of Seattle-Tacoma. And I was part of a striker unit. So strikers are these really big 8-wheeled vehicles that are generally used for urban operations, but given what we needed in Afghanistan, we kind of used them for more rural type operations. And once I got there, we deployed immediately to Afghanistan. I went from graduating college, going through all that training, I mean, I never had a break, to going to Afghanistan in under a year.
Under a year?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
It was very quick. And when we got to Afghanistan, we were at the height of our surge there. President Obama had ordered a surge to counteract a lot of what the Taliban was doing in that area. Osama bin Laden had just been killed, about a year and a half, maybe 2 years prior at that point. And so tensions were still high in the area. Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, was still at large. He's now dead, but at the time he was at large. Mm-hmm. And the area we went to was considered the home and heartland of the Taliban. So the local populations were very sympathetic to their cause, and that made counterinsurgency work very difficult. I have lost some friends over there, certainly more who were wounded, and we were typically in firefights about every day over there. It was just a rough place to be. One of the biggest problems we had was actually working with some of our Afghan partners there, for reasons being that the Taliban would threaten their families and say, hey, if you don't work with us, we'll kill them. Obviously, that's never something we're going to do. Right. And they would gain leverage on the people we were working with to either sabotage missions or do what we call green on blue attacks, which is when they would actually fire upon U.S. soldiers who were their partners. And we would share bases with them and things like that. So, yeah, stress was very high when we were there. And for us, one of the hardest days that I remember was August 23rd, 2012. My platoon was given a mission to conduct create an outpost just northeast of our forward operating base. This was to interdict a substantial amount of IED making material and actually opium that was going through the area. Afghanistan is one of the largest producers of opium, and the Taliban actually they were against it before the war, but now because they realized they could make some money off of selling it, they've actually been complicit with the trade. So we were going to set up an outpost, stop them from moving the stuff, detain the individuals, seize the material. Right. And as we went into the village that day, it kind of looked like a ghost town. And as I was mentioning before, those Afghan partners weren't exactly partners that day. They had leaked our mission to the Taliban, and we were walking into an ambush. So one of my soldiers, as we're walking in, sees some wires on the ground and says, "Sir, hey, we're walking on pretty much a minefield here," and bam, just blow up. My world goes completely dark, and I hit the ground, I wake up, I roll on my back, I look down, and I realize the legs I'd stood on for the first 23 years of my life were no longer there. Bomb severed them off, and
so they were completely severed in the bomb.
Yeah. It was a bit of a shock and a lot to take in about 2 or 3 seconds. But your training kicks in, and I tried to put a tourniquet on, but there was actually shrapnel damage in my right arm. You probably noticed as you shook my hand, my hand's a little cold. I have nerve damage here, so it's a little erratic with the temperature. And since the pain was localized, I couldn't grab it, and I didn't realize I couldn't grab my tourniquet. Okay. But like you'd expect, America's heroes, my platoon, were just the best of the best that day and kept me alive. My medic came up to me kind of with disregard for his own life, put 2 tourniquets on my legs, saved me, stopped me from bleeding to death. And my platoon cordoned the area off to prohibit that ambush from occurring. And my men were able to carry me over grape rows because I kept sliding off the improvised litter device and things like that because of all the blood and sweat and dirt, and got me to a medevac that got me to safety and stabilization. that eventually transported me from Afghanistan to Germany, and then from Germany to Washington, D.C. at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where I began my recovery.
So how much span time was that from the injury to getting to Walter Reed in Washington?
You know, I'm not going to lie to you, my memory's a little foggy, but it was about 4 or 5 days. The biggest thing they want to do is get you out of Afghanistan. They realize that any surgery that's going to be certainly orthopedic in nature and certainly requiring some elements of plastic surgery is best done back either in Germany or in the United States, preferably the United States. We have a couple bases in Germany, obviously from our presence there since the end of the Second World War. There's a couple great hospitals there, but they don't have the medical personnel that we have back here in the United States. So, or the amount of them. Certainly high quality, just not the amount of doctors. So when you go to Germany, they really just make sure that you're stable for transatlantic flight. And so it took about 4 or 5 days before, from time of injury to me landing at Andrews Air Force
How long were
Base.
you in Washington, D.C.?
Well, about 3 years.
And what did you do during that time, besides obviously convalescing and how many surgeries?
So it was over 20. The biggest thing that you try to do, now I'm certainly not a doctor or someone in the medical professions, but the largest problem they see is infections from these types of wounds. I mean, obviously the bombs they use, these are not clean. This is not a clean amputation. They're using typically dried out fertilizer or other things from nitrogen, and all that stuff gets shot into your legs when you're injured. And obviously that's prime for infection and not only losing more of your leg, but potentially your life. So the first dozen or so surgeries were really just cleaning out the legs, making sure that there was nothing there so that when they would actually sew me back together, they weren't leaving me prone to an infection down the road.
Right.
So it took about 2.5, 3 months of just being inpatient, sitting in a hospital room to clean me up and bring me down to surgery about once or twice a week. Once that was done, it took me about 1.5 years to learn how to walk again. It is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes you'll be moving forward with recovery and we're excited and you want to walk, but then your skin will break down because it's not used to being in a prosthetic limb. And there are ups and downs with it, but you get motivated by the people that you work with and you see. One of my good friends actually is just putting out support of our campaign. He's a great guy. His name's Travis Mills. He's one of the few living quadruple amputees from Iraq and Afghanistan. He's missing all 4 limbs. I would encourage your viewers to check out his Netflix documentary. He's just an amazing human being. This is not political. He's just an awesome person and talks about his journey with his family before deployment and after his injury and what he's done since. And he's an inspiring human being, has his foundation out there for wounded vets. Great human being. Look up Travis Mills.
Okay.
Awesome. But he also inspired me to push forward through my injury. And during that recovery process, you look for what's next. I had often defined myself early in life as someone who was going to push things physically, whether it was on the football field or at Ranger School or in the Army, and that just wasn't going to be the case anymore. I wasn't going to be someone who was going to kick in doors and chase down America's enemies. And for me, I was looking for something more to do. What would often happen, I would be done with my physical therapy at 9 a.m, and then the Army's like, okay, go back to your room. It's like, I can only read so much, for a day.
Right.
And one of those days, Senator Ron Johnson came and visited me in the hospital. He had no idea what my political beliefs were, just knew wounded vet from Wisconsin. So he came and visited. And we chatted for 45 minutes, and he came to realize 2 things with me. 1, I'm pretty opinionated, and 2, we saw eye to eye on a few things. Mm-hmm. And he was like, Jason, what do you do all day? And I was like, I get done with my therapy at 9. And I just sit up here and said, how about you come down and work with me on the Hill? So we were actually part of a pilot program there.
Okay.
that for either Republicans or Democrats to get wounded vets to go down and work with members of Congress down there. Obviously not political because we're still in uniform, so typically we work on defense issues, veterans issues, and some foreign policy issues. And so I did that for a year. And it was great. I learned how dysfunctional Washington can be, but I also learned what great leadership can bring to the table, and I saw that with Senator Johnson. While I was doing that, I got to meet a lot of great people. Obviously, he sits on the Foreign Relations Committee. I got to meet the various ambassadors, people who are part of the resistance for the Putin regime over in Russia. Worked with him on the National Defense Authorization Act, which I think is very important with what we need to face here in the 21st century with a rising China. But that wasn't certainly as big of an issue 5-6 years ago now. But I learned a lot. I also finished my master's degree at Georgetown. When I was there, I went to the School of Foreign Service and the Security Studies program there. It was a tremendous experience to be taught by professors and by people who have been in the policy thicket for a long period of time.
So that was a master's degree?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yep.
And then from there?
Well, I grew a little homesick and wanted to come back to Wisconsin. So when I was accepted to Wisconsin Law School, I came back and went to law school. As you know, can be an interesting experience. But I think my background and just being able to kind of drive through tough things helped me in law school. And when I finished law school in just a couple of years ago now, in 2018, I moved back to Hudson. I had always wanted to come back here. My upbringing here is something that I would love my children to be able to have. It's something that, as I've seen not only a lot of this country, but a lot of the world, I feel like we have something very special and unique here. And I love living here. And so that's why I moved back, and I was working for the senator. You and I talked about me coming and working, at your firm a little bit. I was looking and exploring private options at some point, or working for a company. I mean, I was looking at a lot of different things because I was, looking at, my life here. And when Congressman Sean Duffy resigned, just now seems, I've been campaigning so long, it seems like years ago, but it was, it was a few months ago now. It began something that, has been quite a process for me. My phone began to blow up the moment he resigned, and I put it to the side, and I didn't want to look at it. I knew what this was about, and I didn't want to hear about it for a couple days. And I talked with Bella, my fiance. Bella is from Brazil.
Okay.
And I met her visiting my Ranger School friend down there who was studying Portuguese 3 years ago. She's a doctor down there, and she's used to their politicians being stabbed in the front, not figuratively in the back. So when I brought up the idea of running for office, she was a little apprehensive. But after I talked with her about it, she said, "Honey, you're doing it for the right reasons. You want to serve again. You want to give back. And even though the Taliban took my legs, America's enemies didn't extinguish my desire to serve. It still burns in me. It's still there. And I see things right now that scare me in the trajectory of our country. I see some ideas being talked about here.
Let's talk about a little bit about those, because so obviously you've got the military experience and having earned a Purple Heart in the Middle East. What are your thoughts there? And there was just an introduction of a Middle East plan that, from President Trump regarding Israel and Palestinians and so forth. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Middle East is, it's quite the quagmire. But there are some things that are developing and have developed over the past 2 decades that I think need, a little bit more attention and explanation. When we look at what's happened since the Twin Towers fell and the Pentagon was attacked and the plane fell in Pennsylvania, we have shifted our obviously military and foreign policy towards the Middle East, and in particular, obviously, Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan in particular, for me, is obviously pertinent because of my experience there, but also because of what I think were the reasons we went there in the first place. Let's remember that Al-Qaeda, which was run by Osama bin Laden, was basically headquartered out of the mountains in Afghanistan, and that the reason we invaded Afghanistan was because Mullah Omar did not give him up. We did ask the leader of the Taliban to say, hey, give us Osama bin Laden. He said no, and we said, fine, we're going to go get him. So we went to Afghanistan. And what happened and transpired over the next, 20 years was one of those things that, while we needed to remove the Taliban from power, we began to do some things in the realm of nation building, which, I think that we need to be giving the Afghans more of the, quite frankly, responsibility to govern. But we should always remember, too, that the reason 9/11 happened in the first place was because Afghanistan, just given its terrain and history, is very hard to govern from Kabul. And so we have capabilities now that didn't exist prior to 9/11. We have drone precision strikes that are something that is a new technology.
Right.
Our ability to project special operations with quick insertion capabilities, whether it's the SEALs, Rangers, Delta, you name it, can go in there and do and conduct operations quickly. That will allow us to keep, in my mind, terrorism at bay in this region. But I think the president's approach has been correct in that he's talking about giving the responsibility more to Afghans, but also maintaining our presence there. Because as we have seen, a lot of these areas are volatile. You can see that right now, just with what the situation is in the Middle East in general. I mean, obviously the lines that were drawn, certainly by the British and French at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, seemed a little bit arbitrary, and we're certainly not taking into to account the various ethnic groups that are in that area. And I think that's led to a lot of conflict, or led to strongman dictatorships that have been able to really keep, the political forces of these nations under wraps, under the table. I think the president's approach with Israel has been the correct one in trying to foster, quite frankly, a stronger relationship, not only with Jerusalem, but with a foothold against what I think is extremism in the area. Remember, Israel is surrounded by a bunch of nations that don't recognize it.
Right.
I mean, I've traveled to Egypt, and one of the things that when you go there, if you have an Israeli passport stamp in your passport, they won't let you in the country. I mean, they don't recognize it, and they're under threat constantly. So we need to foster that relationship with Israel and make sure that they have the resources they need to defend themselves, because at the end of the day, they are surrounded by a bunch of people who wish that they weren't there. I think that one of the biggest perpetrators and facilitators of destabilization, not only in Israel, but across Iraq and Afghanistan, was Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani was the head of the Iranian Quds Force, and the Quds Force is a clandestine operation arm of the Revolutionary Army in Iran. This is kind of more of, so it's kind of hard for us as Americans to kind of understand, because we actually have, in my mind, a great separation of obviously local police forces, and then federal, and then the military. In Iran, that's not the case. You have their regular army and the Revolutionary Guard, which in my mind is more akin to the political arm of government, and quite frankly, in my opinion, very akin to like the SS in Nazi Germany, where you had the regular army and then the SS. Same thing with Iran. This guy led the clandestine operations of their equivalent of the SS, and was responsible for the know-how and production of IEDs that would be spread amongst Iraq and Afghanistan. He very well could have been responsible for certainly the know-how, blueprint, and leadership of the IED that got me, and certainly was responsible for deaths of some of my friends. Not only that, this guy has given terrorism know-how to Hezbollah for a long period of time. So when we bring it back to Israel, this guy was just kind of an orchestrator of chaos. Right. So I was supportive of the president's strike to eliminate him. I find that when some people have called this man a foreign government official that the president assassinated, I kind of shrug and I'm like, language can be used in ways that I just find to be ridiculous sometimes. No one called, and I think when President Obama called in the SEALs to go after Osama bin Laden, no one said that President Obama assassinated Osama bin Laden.
Right.
He was killed. Qasem Soleimani was a terrorist, and his death was something that should have been, quite frankly, done in my mind a long time ago.
Okay. Well, on that topic of foreign relations, but now transitioning to our country, is immigration, and you said that that's one of the topics that you've heard on the campaign trail. So, what is your perspective on immigration, having currently being engaged to someone's from another country?
I never thought growing up here in northern Wisconsin that I would be dealing with immigration, maybe a couple Canadians trying to cross Lake Superior. It's just one of those things that you don't really think about. I didn't think about, at least growing up. President Trump identified a problem. We needed to build a wall down in the southern border. There is thousands of people crossing illegally monthly. We need border security there, but we also have to look at this problem on the whole. And when you go down there and you're apprehended and you go to a deportation proceeding right now, there's a backlog of 6 to 7 months. There's just not enough judges to go through these claims and these issues. And you can't hold someone indefinitely, so they're released. And a majority of them aren't coming back to the deportation proceeding. Why does that exist in the first place? The president's identified a problem from an executive angle, but the real problem in my mind lies in the legislature, because the way the immigration and nationality statutes are currently written, it's an onion layer on top of an onion layer on top of an onion layer. And really, to me, part of the problem is that with these loopholes that exist, there are incentives for certainly coyotes or predators, in my mind, to be pushing people from what we call the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, through Mexico and across the border. They understand that there are certain things, certainly like the deportation backlog, certain things like that can be taken advantage of, and they pursue it. I go through this process all the time. I'm going through an immigration process as we speak. My fiance and I have been dealing with this now for 7 months, since I proposed to her, and then we began the legal paperwork for a fiance visa. I'm trained in the law. I trained myself in some of this, and it takes me time to navigate this and layer on top of layer, whether you're dealing with Homeland Security, State Department, border security. I mean, there's so many entities involved in this. I can only imagine what it's like for someone who doesn't have the training that you or I have. And so I think the system right now not only incentivizes the illegal immigration, it stymies the legal immigration into this country. There are ways.
How would you fix it?
Well, I think that we need to basically streamline this process into either one bureaucracy or one department, because right now you have too many dealing with it. And when you have bureaucracies trying to communicate with each other, we all know that goes slower than molasses. There can be a way of working with. My example is more pertinent to a fiance visa, so a K-1 visa. The issue for me is obviously one that is bureaucratic, but when you're talking about temporary work visas or other things like that nature, I think that it'd be more important for the federal government to actually work with the states in identifying what they need for a workforce. Obviously, Arizona is going to have a different interpretation of this than the state of Wisconsin will. And I know that there are farmers up here that need help and need the work. While at the same time, we need to respect the laws of this country and not have the under-the-table stuff that has been going on as well. But again, unless you actually have an effective mechanism, unless you actually have an effective way of processing these claims, and not only claims, but petitions, really what they are, you're gonna keep having the same thing. But that's the problem in Washington right now, is there is no work on this. I think there's an incentive, in my opinion, on the other side of the aisle to not fix this problem, because it helps exacerbate more of a political dialogue that can be used at the polling stations. And the right thing to do is begin the work on changing the way the languages are written in the statutes and streamlining the process through really one agency or one department.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry we didn't get to trade or healthcare, but I know that you sound like you've really done your homework on those issues, and definitely, as you said, you're an opinionated person. How can folks that are watching learn more about you?
Well, you can visit my website, www.churchforwisconsin.com. You can follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at JasonChurchWI. Look for the stuff we're posting. We'll be happy to respond. Me and my team kind of get around this very large district of ours. And really at the end of the day, for me, the biggest thing and the reason I'm running is that we need less people who are career politicians running for office. We don't need people trying to just move up the ladder. We need people who see a need to serve now in the context we're in and can make a difference. And I think opinions and positions that come from outside of politics are what's needed in Washington right now. So I ask all of you in the 7th for your vote, support, and to lace your boots up with me and join our platoon.
All right, very good. And that's churchforwisconsin.com. And somebody with some real-world experiences certainly loves our country and has sacrificed a lot already, and appreciate your willingness to run, and wish you luck.
Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate it.
And so that's Jason Church, candidate for 7th Congressional District. There's a primary on February 18th, and I encourage you folks that are watching, please get out there and vote. Thank you for watching.